Hello, welcome everyone. We are so excited to have you join us today for Office Hours, Microsoft AZ-900 Fundamentals with our Azure Content Director, Guy Hummel. Before Guy takes the lead, there are a few announcements. This webinar is being recorded and will be shared via email when it is available. We highly recommend that you connect to today's webinar via computer audio to decrease technical difficulties. At the end of the webinar, we will hold a live Q&A session. Some of you have already submitted your questions when you registered, but if a question pops up during the duration of the webinar, feel free to submit through the Q&A box on your attendee panel. Speaking of the end of the webinar, there will be a brief end of webinar survey that takes, on average, less than 2 minutes. We truly appreciate your feedback as it helps us improve your webinar experience in the future. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Guy.
Hi, I'm Guy Hummel, and I'm the Azure Content Director at Cloud Academy. We're going to start off with some details about the AZ-900 exam. Then we'll spend the majority of the time going over sample questions. These won't be actual questions from the real exam. They'll just be samples that we've come up with for this webinar. Then I'll give you some exam tips, both for preparing for the exam and for taking the exam itself. And then we'll have a question and answer session at the end. All right, the exam details. So first, there are no prerequisites for this exam, which isn't surprising considering that it's a fundamentals level exam, so it's sort of the most basic level that you can take. The exam's only 1 hour long, which is shorter than most other exams. Most of them are at least 2 hours long. The number of questions does vary a bit, but it's generally somewhere between 40 and 50 questions. So if you do the math, that means you only have about a minute per question, a little bit more than that, but not much more. For the types of questions, Microsoft is a bit unusual compared to its competitors in that it has quite a variety of question types. So like everyone else, they do have multiple choice questions, but they also have some other ones like what I call true false with repeated scenario. How this works is they give you a relatively short scenario, so it's not like a full case study or anything, but it's some kind of a problem that you need to solve. And then they tell you a proposed solution, and they ask you, would this solution meet the requirements of this scenario? And so you just say yes or no. And then you move on to the next question, and they give you the same scenario again, but they give you a different solution. And they ask you if this solution would work. And these sound like they're relatively easy questions because they're basically just true false. But they're a little bit tricky because what quite often happens is on the first question, you'll read the solution and you'll think, yeah, that works. So you say yes, and you move on to the next question. And then they have a slightly different solution.
Hi,
And you
Guy.
realize,
It looks
oh,
and sounds like some people are having some issues hearing and viewing. Yeah, people are saying they're having a spinning wheel. Everyone, just give us a couple seconds to try to figure out what's happening. We're so sorry. I think we might have fixed it. Is it?
okay, can you see it?
I can see it. Can someone put in the chat? Oh, looks like we've got a good. Yep, I think we're good.
Okay, let's try this again. All right, I'm Guy Hummel, and I'm the Azure Content Director at Cloud Academy. So I'm going to do this a little more quickly than I was intending to, since we got off to a late start. But I'm going to go through a few details about the AZ-900 exam. Then we'll spend quite a bit of time going over sample questions, and then I'll give you a few exam tips, and then we'll have a Q&A session at the end. Okay, so the exam details. So there aren't any prerequisites for the AZ-900 exam. It's a fundamentals level exam. And I mean, frankly, there aren't prerequisites for almost any of the Azure exams, but there definitely aren't for AZ-900. It's only an hour long, which is quite a bit shorter than most of the exams. Most of them are around 2 hours. This one's only an hour. Number of questions can vary a little bit, but it's typically around 40 or 50 questions. Now, the types of questions you can get, Microsoft has all kinds of different questions. So they do have multiple choice, like AWS and Google do, but they also have these other kinds of questions, like, for example, true, false with repeated scenario. That's not what they call it, that's what I call it. It's basically, they give you a scenario and they say, what's your solution to this? And then they give a proposed solution and they ask you if this solution meets the requirements. And then you say yes or no. And then you go to the next question. And then they give you the same scenario again, and they give you a different solution. And they say, does this solution meet the requirements? And the trick with these ones is that you can't go back. So if you get to the second solution and you're like, oh, this solution actually works and the previous one didn't because it was missing something, it doesn't let you go back to the previous one. So then you say yes or no to this one, and they give it to you again. There's a third solution. And again, you can't go back. So they're true false questions, but they're a little bit more stressful than your usual true false questions. It's quite common for them to have multiple true false questions on one page. So they'll ask you, say, 3 different questions on the same page about the same topic area. And those 3 questions will contribute towards you getting full points for what's essentially one question, right? So like if you only get 1 right out of those 3, then you essentially get 1/3 of points you would normally get for a full question. And they have drag and drop, which it's a little bit hard to describe, but I'll actually show you an example of this when we get to the sample questions. But it's where you actually use your mouse to drag some text or a little text box from one side of the screen over to another to like fill in a box somewhere or a blank or whatever. They have ones where you can choose from drop-down menus, and these are typically where, let's say, they'll give you there'll be a sentence with a blank in it, and then there'll be a drop-down menu with that blank, and you can choose from a few different options in that blank. And quite often they'll give you multiple blanks that you have to fill in for one question. They might have other types as well. It's incredible how many different types of questions they have, and compared to their competitors, especially with AWS and Google, they usually pretty much just have multiple choice and multiple select maybe. So anyway, Microsoft's quite creative that way. So now the topics on the AZ-900 exam, and these did change back in May. The exam guide for AZ-900 changed quite a bit. There used to be 6 sections, and now there are only 3. They kind of moved things around and took some things out, added some more things. So what we have now are describe cloud concepts, describe Azure architecture and services, and describe Azure management and governance. So I'll just quickly go through each one of these. Okay, so the first one, cloud concepts. So the key things you need to know here are the difference between public, private, and hybrid cloud models, right? So the public cloud model is Azure, basically. Private is you're doing it entirely on your own premises, and hybrid is some combination of those. Cloud pricing models, the benefits of a cloud solution like high availability, scalability, manageability, all these terms. Cloud service types like infrastructure as a service, also known as IaaS, platform as a service or PaaS, and software as a service or SaaS. They typically do have a few questions on these, so you really do need to know the difference between them. And it also really helps if you know which Azure services fall into each one of these categories. I mean, there are tons of Azure services, so of course you don't have to know all of them, but you know, a good example of infrastructure as a service is Azure Virtual Machines, and a good example of platform as a service is Azure App Service, for example. Okay, so then the next one is Azure Architecture and Services. So you need to know about subscriptions, management groups, and resource groups, which are just, they're sort of different levels of organization of your resources. Regions, data centers, and availability zones, Azure Virtual Machines, Azure Virtual Networks, Azure Storage, Azure Active Directory, role-based access control, Microsoft Defender for Cloud, which used to be called Azure Security Center. So there was a name change a while ago for that one. And I obviously haven't listed everything you need to know here for this section, but these are the things that for sure you do need to know. Okay, Azure Management and Governance. You need to know Azure Cost Management, Azure Policy. This is where, like, for example, you can say, you can only create databases in this particular region, you know, things like that, typically for compliance reasons. Resource locks. You'll almost certainly see at least one question on resource locks, where you can prevent a resource from being deleted or modified. You need to know about the Azure portal, the Azure command line interface, PowerShell, and the Cloud Shell. So basically just all the different ways you can interact with Azure. ARM templates, that is Azure Resource Manager templates. And these are the ways that you can automate the deployment of Azure resources. Azure Advisor, that gives you tips about how you could save money or improve your security, things like that. Azure Service Health, that tells you how, if there are any Azure services that are down, any Azure regions that are down, things like that, things that are basically outside of your control. Azure Monitor, log analytics, and application insights that are all to help you monitor your Azure resources. Okay, so we're going to move on to the sample questions now. So question number 1. Your company needs to deploy an application on a cloud service that can automatically add and remove compute resources to match the usage level. What feature does the service need to have to meet this requirement? It's high availability, fault tolerance, disaster recovery, and elasticity. So this is that part in the first section, the cloud concept section, that I was telling you about, where you need to know all these different terms, right? So you need to tell what's the difference between these things. And high availability. Okay, so what the question is asking is, you need to be able to add and remove compute resources. So high availability is not appropriate, because that's about keeping the service up and running, even if there are failures. Okay, so it's kind of related, but it's not quite the same thing. Fault tolerance is actually very similar to high availability. It's also that in spite of failures, the service keeps running. Disaster recovery is if the service actually goes down and you need to come back up again. How do you, disaster recovery helps with that. And so that's not exactly it either. So elasticity is the only one left. And that is what elasticity means, is that the service can automatically add and remove compute resources to match the usage level. All right. You'll also sometimes see scalability as another term, and scalability is actually very related to elasticity, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's automatic if you see scalability. So anyway, the answer here is D, elasticity. So this is a relatively easy question. You should see a few of these types of questions about cloud concepts. Okay, number 2. Your business is transitioning from an entirely on-premises IT environment to one hosted entirely in the public cloud. Which statement describes how your capital expenditures and operating expenses for IT resources will change? So there's capital expenditures will decrease and operating expenses will increase, or operating expenses will decrease and capital expenditures will increase. Did I say decrease? I think so. To the first one. The third one is operating expenses will increase and capital expenditures will stay the same. Oh, there's a spelling mistake there. Sorry about that. And the last one is capital expenditures will increase and operating expenses will stay the same. Now, so these are basically just variations, right? So the question is, first of all, do capital expenditures increase, decrease, or stay the same? So one of the key things you need to know about using a public cloud is that your capital expenditures should decrease because you pay for cloud resources in a different way from how you pay for resources in your on-premises environment. All right, so on-premises, you're typically buying, large computer equipment and system software and things like that you only do periodically, like maybe once every year or something, or a couple of years even. And with operating expenses, you're paying on a monthly basis. So in the public cloud, like Azure, you're paying on a monthly basis, which is operating expenses. So the capital expenditures should decrease if you're moving to the public cloud. And the operating expenses should increase. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my, oops, there we go. All right, so A is the correct answer there. All right, question number 3. A web development company requires a managed hosting environment so that its developers can upload their web applications without having to administer the web servers or install software patches. Which cloud deployment model would you recommend to them as they migrate to the Azure cloud? Infrastructure as a service, software as a service, platform as a service, or infrastructure as code? So the key thing here is that you don't want to have to administer the web servers or install software patches. Now, if it were infrastructure as a service, then you would have to do these things, right? You would have to do things like install software patches. So it's not A. Software as a service is where it would be something like Microsoft 365, right? Where it's a complete software suite and you're just using the software, right? So you're not sort of building data center components. You're just using the software. And that's not what we're talking about here. This is where we're actually building web applications. So it's not B. Platform as a service is exactly what we're talking about here. This is where it makes it easy for you to build applications where you don't need to do a lot of management. But you do still need to do some things. I mean, you need to work with your web application. So C looks like the right one, but let's take a quick look at the last one, which is infrastructure as code. And infrastructure as code is, it's a concept you actually don't need to know for AZ-900, but this is where you can basically automate the deployment of Azure resources. And so that's not what we're talking about here. So the answer is C, platform as a service. Question number 4. Your company is going to create a hybrid application that uses both on-premises and Azure resources. These components need to communicate with each other without going over the internet. Which service should you use? Okay, so now we're getting into the core services. This is a different section. This is no longer cloud concepts. This is when we're getting into the actual specific services that are available in Azure. And so this is a hybrid application. So we're using both on-premises and Azure Resources. And they need to communicate with each other without going over the internet. Now, a virtual network is something that you probably need to have on the Azure side of things, but it's only on the Azure side of things. It's not about the communication with your on-premises environment. So it's not that one. VPN gateway. Now, this is a hybrid technology. This is something that allows you to connect your on-premises and Azure resources, but it goes over the internet. It's encrypted, but it does go over the internet. Right? It's a virtual private network. And so that can't be it, because in the question it says it can't go over the internet. The third one is ExpressRoute. And ExpressRoute is a dedicated connection between your on-premises environment and Azure. It doesn't go over the internet. And so that looks like that's the correct one. But let's take a look at the last one. The last one is virtual network peering, which is something you also need to know about for this exam. But this is where you can connect two different Azure virtual networks together. You can peer them so that resources in those two networks can talk to each other. And that's very useful and all, but it's not a hybrid networking technology. It doesn't help you with your on-premises environments, at least not directly. So the answer is C, ExpressRoute. Question number 5. Your company has a team of administrators who can create and delete virtual machines, but you want to prevent anyone from deleting a virtual machine called VM1. What should you use? Azure Policy, Resource Lock, Network Security Group, or Tag. So Azure Policy, I mentioned this a little bit at the beginning. Azure Policy is where you can say things like people can only create databases in let's say the US West region, or maybe a particular European region like UK South or something like that. And that's not what we're talking about here. We're saying that we want to prevent anyone from deleting a particular virtual machine, VM1. So it's not Azure Policy. The Resource Lock is where you can prevent someone from either deleting or modifying a particular Azure resource. So that looks like the right one, but let's look at the last two. There's Network Security Group, which is, it's basically firewall rules for your virtual network. And so, you could use that to prevent people from communicating with a virtual machine, but it wouldn't prevent particular people from deleting that virtual machine. So that's not it. And a tag is something that you can use to, you could tag a bunch of virtual machines with the same tag, and then that would be helpful for cost management purposes and things like that. So that's not it. So the answer is Resource Lock, B. Question number 6. Complete the following statement. Authorization determines blank. Okay, so this is my attempt at simulating a fill in the blank question. It's a pretty short one. Most of them are not this short. And I don't have the drop-down menu in here, but normally you'd have a drop-down you could choose from. So I sort of turned this into a multiple choice question. Okay, but authorization determines which of these: who you are, why you need access, what team you're in, or what you can do. Well, who you are is actually authentication, right? So that's something that's handled by typically Azure Active Directory. So that's not it. Authorization is, well, I'll get to that in a second. Okay, let's look at the second answer here. Why you need access. Why you need access is typically not something that is going to be put into the system, at least not directly. So that's not what authorization is about. What team you're in is something that you can put in. Sorry, I should have muted my notifications, so I'm getting distracted by something that's happening here. Okay, what team you're in is something that you can put in Azure Active Directory. You can divide people into different groups, and you can put their IDs in these different groups. But that's not what authorization is. Authorization determines what you can do. So authentication says who you are. It only verifies that you are the person you say you are. But what you can actually do, what you're allowed to do, the permissions that you have inside of Azure, that's something that's under authorization. And that's actually handled by a separate system, not Azure Active Directory, for the most part. There's a separate system called role-based access control. And that's the one that's for authorization. So the answer is D. Okay, question number 7. Your company has several important virtual machine instances running as part of your operations. You plan on running these instances for over 1 year. You want to save costs on these instances to reduce your operating expenses. Which instance pricing model would you select? So there's spot pricing, reserved pricing, pay-as-you-go pricing, and standard pricing. Now, spot pricing is where you can get virtual machines for very cheap prices, like 80% off, I think it is. But the catch with these ones is that Azure can remove them with only 30 seconds notice, I think it is, right? So it's kind of a crazy model where you definitely don't want to put anything mission critical on these virtual machines because they could disappear at any moment. And so there are only a few use cases for that. And that's things like if you're doing heavy computations, data analytics computation or something like that, where you need a whole bunch of virtual machines. And if one of them disappears, then you can just replace it with another one and you can restart the part of the computation it was working on or something, right? So it's a very specific sort of use case. So that's not what we need here because these are important virtual machine instances, according to the question, that we're planning on running for over 1 year. So it's not A. Reserved pricing looks promising. We'll come back to that one. Pay-as-you-go pricing is the default pricing model. And this is where you just pay for the resources as you use them. And so you can use that for virtual machine instances that you're going to run for a year. You'll just get a bill every month and that's it. But if you want to save money on this, because you know that you're going to be running these instances for over a year, then pay-as-you-go isn't the best option. And standard pricing is something I just made up. And so it's not D, standard pricing. There are a few pricing tiers sometimes that are called standard for particular services, but that's not what we're talking about here. So the answer is B, reserved pricing. And this is where you can reserve a virtual machine or multiple virtual machines for a year or 3 years, and you can save a lot of money by doing this. But of course, if you decide to stop running those virtual machines, then you're going to be paying. I think either you're going to keep paying for them or you're paying a penalty. I forget which it is. So reserved pricing is the way to go. Okay, question number 8. You have the following blob storage accounts on Azure. Storage 1, 2, and 3 are the names of these. And the default tier for each one of these. The first one, the default tier is cool. Second one is hot. And the third one is archive. For each of the following statements, select yes or no. So now this is the question type I was telling you about, where you have 3 true-false questions on the same page on a particular topic. But you have to get all 3 of them correct to get full points for this sort of overall question, if you will. Okay, so the first one is, the storage 2 account has the highest storage costs, yes or no? Well, let's take a look. So storage 2 has a default tier of hot. So the thing you need to know is that there are storage costs and there are access costs. And if you're in the hot tier, those are the highest storage costs. But the hot tier has the lowest access costs. All right, and so then it flips as you go through these different tiers. So the archive tier, which is at the other end of the spectrum, has the lowest storage costs and the highest access costs. Right, and that's because it's very cheap to store things in archive storage because it's actually offline. They're putting it on some very cheap storage that's offline. But if you need to access it, then it needs to be brought back. It needs to be rehydrated, as they call it. And that's an expensive process. And so you pay more to access that data. So, and cool is in between, right? So cool sort of has medium storage costs and medium access costs. So let's look at these again. So the storage 2 account has the highest storage costs. It's the hot tier. So that's true. Let's do this because the hot tier is highest for storage but lowest for access. Okay, so then the second question is, the storage 2 account has the highest access costs. Well, no, that's not true because it has the lowest access costs. The one that has the highest access costs is archive. And then the last one is data in storage 1 should be stored for at least 30 days. Storage 1 is in the cool tier, and that is how the cool tier works. That if you put something in there, you'll get lower storage costs. But if you move the data out of the cool tier before 30 days, you'll pay a penalty. All right, so it should be stored in there for at least 30 days. All right, so the answer is yes to that one. I'm just going to mention one more thing about this series of questions before we move on, and that's that it might seem odd that we're saying the default tier rather than just the access tier for the storage account. The reason for that is that when you create a storage account, you create a default tier, and if you don't set that to anything yourself, it will default to hot. And you can go in and change individual blobs even within a storage account so that each one of them can have a different tier, right? You can do that at the individual level. But if you don't set them, then it will just go with whatever the default tier is for the storage account. So that's why it's said that way. I will say that this is an example of a relatively difficult question for AZ-900. I would say this one's pretty tricky. Some of the other ones were not so hard, like the very first question we had wasn't so hard. This one's sort of at the other end of the scale. But you will definitely have some questions that are at least this hard. Okay, sample question number 9. So this is my attempt at showing you what a drag and drop question looks like. So match each service with its description. Drag each service on the left to the box that is next to the appropriate description for that service on the right. So you see on the left, we have these 4 services: Log Analytics, Service Health, Application Insights, and Azure Advisor. So obviously I can't show you the dragging and dropping process like on a real exam, but I'll just show you where all of these would end up in the answer column when we're done. Okay, so let's look at the first description. It helps you follow best practices to optimize your Azure deployments. Well, that one is Azure Advisor. That's what that does. So that's the bottom one there. Okay. The next one is provides application performance management and monitoring for live web apps. And that's Application Insights, which is the second from the bottom. Application Insights is part of Azure Monitor, which is a little bit confusing. Azure Monitor has a bunch of different things within it, and one of them is Application Insights, and that one is specifically about application performance management and monitoring. Okay, and then the third one is lets you run queries on Azure Monitor log data. Well, looking at the names of the services, that's very obvious which one that would be, because one of them even has log in the name, and that's Log Analytics, the top one. Right, so that's the one that lets you run queries on Azure Monitor log data. And then the last one is notifies you about Azure service incidents and planned maintenance. And that is Service Health, the second one. So, oh, sorry, I should have done these in the, There we go. Okay, so service help is the one that will tell you about things that problems with Azure itself, rather than problems with your own application. So for example, if you're trying to diagnose an issue with your application being down, you can take a look at service health to see if it's a problem with Azure itself, and that's why it's down. Or if you have to go and look at, is there some problem in your application that took it down, right? So service health is quite handy that way. All right, now moving on to exam tips. So preparation tips, of course, I'm going to say this because it's my learning path, but I recommend going through Cloud Academy's AZ-900 exam preparation learning path. If you do go through that, I want to say that you should not skip the required reading for AZ-900 exam, because particularly when things change in the exam, it can take us a little while to add new content to take care of that. And also in some cases, there are like these little topics that don't fit in any of our courses. And so we'll just have, some links to the documentation for those in the required reading. So if it's in required reading, it's not covered elsewhere in the learning path, and you'll need to go through those. We don't have too many in there, but okay. Get a high percentage on our AZ-900 practice exam. You can take it multiple times because there's a large pool of questions that it picks from. And I will say though that even if you do get a high percentage on the practice exam, we're not guaranteeing you're going to pass the real one, but at least it will give you a pretty good idea if you're ready or not. You should also review Microsoft's AZ-900 exam guide, because it will tell you all of the different topics you need to know. And as you're looking through that, you can just make sure that you do know the basics of each one of those topics that's in the exam guide. Okay, so now taking the actual exam, check in at least 15 minutes before the start time. They'll send you an email that gives you instructions for what you need to do. And it might even be 30 minutes before the start time that you need to go, but make sure you get there early. You don't want to get disqualified because you were late getting to the exam. Manage your time in the exam. Now I said that there are typically 40 to 50 questions, say around 50 questions for AZ-900, and you get an hour. So that means you have about 1 minute per question. All right, so keep that in mind as you're going through it. When you've gone through the first 10 questions, see if you're at around the 10-minute mark or hopefully less. And, did I get that right? Yeah, make sure that you're going at about a minute per question. Okay, and there's a countdown timer in the exam that will help you do that, but try not to look at it too often because it can be distracting. Just periodically see if you're on track. Okay, you can mark a question for review if it's taking up too much of your time. And then when you get to the end of the exam, it'll give you a list of all the questions, and it will tell you whether you answered them or not and which ones you marked for review. And so if you want to go back to a question that you marked for review, you can just click on that and it'll take you right there. So that's a good thing to do if a question is really taking up too much time and you don't want to get off track. However, as I mentioned, like the true false with repeated scenario questions, those don't allow you to go back. So do bear that in mind when you're answering those questions, is that you can never go back on those ones. Now, you have two different ways you can take the exam. You can either take it remotely or you can take it at a testing center. And it might seem like it would be much easier and more relaxing to do it remotely, like at your house. But bear in mind that it's actually more difficult to do it that way. And the reason is because, the reason is that because they don't know, they can't see you other than through the camera on your laptop. There are more stringent rules about what you can do while you're taking the exam than if you were in a testing center, right? Because in a testing center, you're in a controlled environment, they can see you, right? If you're taking it from home, then you have to keep your eyes on the screen the whole time. because if you're looking away, then they think that you might be cheating, right? And this actually happened to me one time where, I was most of the way through the exam, and I was kind of tired, and I was thinking about a question, and I looked away from the screen for 5 seconds or something, and then it exited me from the exam and said that I had violated the rules. And so I had to contact technical support, and after, I think it was 45 minutes, they got me back into the exam again. And so that was a little stressful. And then I had to finish the exam after I got in, because they watched the recording of me and decided that, well, actually, I probably hadn't cheated, right? Which of course I hadn't. So they let me back in again. So I tell you this because, you have to be prepared for that if you take it from home, it's a little bit more stressful. So if you do, make sure you read the rules carefully and follow their instructions. I have done a lot of exams remotely, and most of the time I haven't had any problems. It was just a couple times. Okay, so having said all that, do try to relax, because you don't have to get a perfect score. You need to get 700 out of 1,000 points, which they say is not exactly 70%, because they do some kind of scaling in the background with these exams, but it's somewhere around 70%. And so you definitely don't have to get every question right. But even if you get below a 700, you can always retake the exam if you have to. It's pretty easy to do a retake. They give you, I think it's 5 per year that you can take. And yes, you do have to pay for it when you take it again, but assuming that you can pay for it, it's not that big a deal. So do try to relax. Okay, and now we'll move on to the Q&A section. So let me see. I'm going to take a look. Looks like we have. Okay, so we have the question, can't we go back on previous questions to review or change the answer in the exam before submitting? And yes, you can, other than the questions, like I mentioned, the true, false with repeated scenario. They normally put those ones at the beginning of the exam, because you can't go back. So they'll give you maybe a couple sets of 3 of those questions. And then once you're done with those, then for the rest of the exam, probably, those are questions you can go back to when you get to the end of the exam, or before then, for that matter, if you really want to. But it's easier to go back to the questions you've marked for review once you've gone through the whole exam. So yes, okay. What is access cost? I'm assuming what that means is how much does the exam cost? And it actually varies by country. For the US, it's $99. For other countries, it's usually less than that, I think. I think there are a few countries where it's more, but in most cases, I think it's actually less than 99 US. Normally, how much time do you need to prepare for the exam? Yes, that's always the question, and it's a hard one to answer because it depends on how much you already know before you start studying. But the AZ-900 exam, thankfully, it's not super in-depth like some of the other exams are. And so I would say you probably need about maybe 20 hours, maybe less, maybe more, but it's not like 60 hours or 100 hours or something. It's down in the range of maybe 15 or 20 or something like that. Okay. Yeah, I should probably say 20 at least. Okay. Oh, how much does the exam cost? We already answered that one. So they have hands-on labs at the end like AWS. Now, Azure used to have hands-on labs. They had them long before AWS did. And if I remember right, AWS only has them for certain exams. They don't have them for all of them. Microsoft used to have them for probably half of the exams had labs. And I took a few exams like that. It was quite interesting. But I think they had so many technical problems with those that they decided to just scrap them altogether. So I haven't seen them put live labs on an exam for a few years, I would say, Yeah, it's probably been a few years. Can you expand on Azure Policy again? Okay. So maybe I'll contrast it with role-based access control. So, which is also known as RBAC for short. Okay. So with RBAC, you give people permissions for things like, you can say, this person, this user can create virtual machines. You might be more specific and say, well, it's not just create. They can create and delete and modify and all that sort of thing, right? Virtual machines. So that would, if they have the virtual machine contributor role. Okay. You can also be more narrow about that, and you can say they have the virtual machine contributor role for this particular resource group, even, or this particular subscription, but yeah, like you can be very specific on what they can access or what they have permission for. But with Azure Policy, you're doing something a little bit different. And this is more for compliance reasons typically. It doesn't have to be compliance, but that's usually what it is. Where you'll say, okay, this person can create virtual machines, sure, but they can only create them in these regions or this region, right? It's particularly useful for when you have data, because if you have compliance requirements for things like your data must reside in Germany, let's say, or in Europe, maybe more broadly. It has to be in the EU. We don't want the data residing in the US, let's say. So then you can set up Azure Policy to say people can only create these data resources in the European region, right? Which is somewhat different from how role-based access control works, right? Which is just about whether or not you can create virtual machines in particular subscriptions. Okay, so I hope that answers the question a little bit. What is the best practice approach for certification? Is need to follow any pre-check topics? I'm actually not quite sure what that question means. Any pre-check topics? I think, like, is this sort of, maybe, are there any prerequisites? Is there something you should learn before you go on to this one? If that's the question, then no, you don't really need to. And if you do take our AZ-900 learning path, it assumes that you have some knowledge about IT. You don't have to know a lot, but you should at least have some idea what, say, databases are and things like that. Can you please explain more about the online exam, the rules, etc.? Right. Sure. So if you're taking it remotely, you need to have an ID card, like a driver's license. So you need to take a picture of it and show it to them. Actually, there's a couple different ways. Sometimes they have you hold it up to the to your video camera, and sometimes you have to take a picture of it. But regardless, you need to do that. You need to show them your testing area. So you actually have to take your laptop and move it around, showing them all the walls in your room and all that sort of thing. So there's this whole, before you take the exam, there's this whole thing you have to do. You have to go through before you start the exam. And then once you get into the exam, you can't look away from the screen. You also can't talk, right? Which you might think, well, I'm not going to talk. I mean, why would I talk? But you'd be surprised sometimes. You might talk to yourself a little bit. You get to a hard question or something, and you'll be like, oh, what? You start talking and you realize, oh, no, I can't talk. The reason they don't want you to talk is because you might be talking to somebody else who's like, across the room from you or something, and you're basically reading the question to them, and then you're hearing the response. They also don't want to hear other people talking in the background. So you need to make sure that you're taking this in some place where you aren't going to have people talking around you. I think they're a little bit lenient, like if it's noisy outside or something, if there's construction work going on or something, then that's fine. But yeah, it's it's tricky. There's a lot you have to be aware of. Oh, you also can't have anything on your desk. You need to show them your desk. You can't use an external monitor. You can only use your laptop. Yeah, they're really quite strict if you're doing it from home. Okay. What else do we have here? Sorry if you already answered this. How long is the actual exam? 1 hour. Okay. Well, they will. I should mention that they do have some time. There's some time at the beginning to go through all of that part with the proctor where you're showing them the room and all that kind of stuff. So it's not until you're done all of that that the 1 hour starts. Okay. If you skip the series questions altogether, can you then go back to them or no? Nope, you can't. Does this mean it's a closed note exam? Yes, that's absolutely true. You are not allowed to have any materials around. You also have to take off your watch. You need to put your phone somewhere out of reach. Yeah, they really don't want you to have anything around that could potentially help you cheat. So no, definitely not an open book exam. For in-center exam, are you allowed to take the cell phone or smartwatch to track time? No, in a testing center, you do have to leave those things behind, but like your phone and your watch. But they'll have a clock on the wall, or they should, so that you can see the time. And there's a clock, there's a countdown timer in the exam. So, you know, you'll be able to track the time regardless. You mentioned you must use a laptop. I think so. I'm actually not sure if it'd be possible to use a desktop computer because they say that you can't have an external monitor. I've always kind of wondered about that, actually. I haven't really looked into it. So sorry, you might have to look that one up. But my guess is that you have to use a laptop. Is there a place I can apply for accommodations for the exam? I'm pretty sure there is. Yeah, there's a frequently asked questions list about Microsoft certifications. I'm pretty sure it's in there that you can get accommodations if you have, you know, disabilities or whatever. Let's see. Any idea how long the lead time is to take the exam? If I'm ready to take it, well, oh, I see. Well, I have to wait weeks to get a slot. Not usually. It's been a little while since I've done one, but usually it was pretty good that way. It might be a few days, but you're not going to have to wait for weeks. Now with the testing center, I should say, it could be different with the testing center. Depends on that particular testing center you want to go to. They might be booked up for some reason. So yeah, I mean, I would check well ahead of time just to make sure. But usually with the online ones, you don't have to book too far in advance. So how are we doing for time? All right. In case of failure in exam, fees will be the same for retake or lesser. No, it's the same cost regardless of which time you're taking the exam. Please provide a use case for each cloud. Well, I'm not sure if we have enough time for that. Let me get through a few more. How many tries do you get to pass the test per $99 that you pay? It's $99 each time you take the exam, and you can take it up to 5 times in 1 year. And the way it works is after you take it the first time, if you need to take it again, you have to wait. I think it might only be 24 hours after the first time. Then if you need to take it again after that, then you have to wait a little bit longer and then a little bit longer. And so eventually, you know, you have to wait for a month or whatever before you can take it again. But there is a limit of 5 times per year. And for each $99, you only get to take the exam once. Actually, this is a good question. Can you please explain the difference between IAM roles and Azure Active Directory roles? Are both RBAC roles? Yeah, this is quite tricky. There are roles when you do role-based access control, you assign a role to someone, and that's something that you do in the IAM section of the resource. So it's the Identity and Access Management menu in a particular Azure resource. And that's role-based access control. That's RBAC. However, Azure Active Directory also has roles, but those roles only control things that are in Azure Active Directory. So, you know, they would be roles that are to do with managing the identity identity management system, right? So someone could be an administrator so that they could you know, create user IDs and things like that in Azure Active Directory. There are roles for that, but that's separate from role-based access control, which is in IAM. I know it's kind of confusing, but that's the way that works. Let's see. Yeah, there's some kind of detailed questions here and we're running out of time. Let's see. Is this fundamentals-based AZ-900 required for further certifications? It's not actually. It's a good idea to take AZ-900 before some of the other ones, but you don't have to. It's not a requirement for anything else, not a prerequisite. What would be the next exam after AZ-900 for a SQL, an SQL developer? That would be the data engineer exam, likely, is the one you'd want to do. Sorry, did I say data engineer? Database engineer, which is DP300. Yeah, some of these will take too long to answer. What I'm going to do is, for any questions that I didn't answer here, I'm going to answer them in email. I'll send them out to the people who asked them. So I'll hand it back to Tia.
Wonderful. Thank you, guys. Well, thank you, Guy, for walking us through that and providing all that information. Sorry about the technical difficulties at the beginning, but I'm glad that we got it up and running. I think that was the most questions we've had for a webinar, and they're still coming in. So we thank you guys for being attentive and being interested in and asking these questions. This is what we really enjoy to do, is helping everyone further along in their journey. So with all that said, just a couple more reminders. This webinar was recorded. It takes a little bit of time to clean it up, but it should be available for everyone via email starting tomorrow. So if you need to rewatch and slow it down and walk along with Guy, that's helpful. And also if you want to share with other peers or classmates, it's a great opportunity as well. And the email will also have the link to the learning path on Cloud Academy. So we would love for you to join us there as well. Again, there's going to be a brief end of webinar survey that pops up. It takes less than 2 minutes. We really appreciate your feedback, so please just take a moment to help us improve. Additionally, you can find more on-demand webinars on our website at cloudacademy.com/webinars. And I believe that's it. So that concludes this webinar. Have a wonderful day, and we hope to see you soon.